Right, good morning, everybody. My name's Susan McKenzie, and I'm the CEO of the Emergency Services Foundation. I'm absolutely thrilled to be bringing you this webinar today around vicarious trauma. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land down here on the Mornington Peninsula, the Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of this gorgeous country and waterways that we have down here. This is a very exciting day for the 4 students that are presenting to you. We've got Hunter, Ella, Gavin and Fredy, who have come all the way from Massachusetts, the Worcester Polytechnic, and that is just outside Boston for those of you who are not familiar. And in a really unique arrangement with ESF, the Worcester Polytechnic has been working with us for a number of years, and traditionally we have one group a year come out here to do a research project. So these are STEM students, so they know nothing about, or they knew nothing about emergency services or vicarious trauma until the start of this last semester. And I think at the end of this presentation today, you will agree with me that they have done a very fine job on the task that they were set. So I'm going to hand over to the students now, and they will walk you through this presentation, which will go for about 30 minutes. And then we will take some questions at the end. With so many people online, it's very hard for me to see when people's hands are up. So please put any questions in the chat and I will facilitate that. So team, over to you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Good morning, everyone. We would like to take this time to thank everyone for your attendance to our webinar and dedication to learning about vicarious trauma. My name is Gavin George.
I'm Hunter Darris. I'm Ella DeVault.
I'm Fredy Lenson.
And now we would like to start with a story. The scene of this event travels back to 2019, the desolate Malakuta fires. Firefighters risked their lives, and in addition to these brave souls, there was another group behind the front line. The support staff stood in horror watching these events, taunting a planning officer with an incident control team to say, "I had no time to settle in." Emergency warnings were being issued left, right, and Malakota. It just kept coming at us. I'm not on the ground, but I know my workplace is on the ground, and communities are on the ground. Not fighting the fires, not being in the forest, the impact and trauma was still there. Vicarious trauma.
What this story emphasizes is the impact that the work of emergency support staff can have on them and the importance of studying and addressing vicarious trauma within the sector. The reason why ESF wanted this study done in the first place was they noticed that the mental health of these support staff was not getting the same attention as the mental health of frontline workers, though both are equally as important. So with this in mind, the objectives of our study were first to understand how vicarious trauma impacts support staff working in Victoria's emergency management sector, then to understand how it is currently being addressed in the sector with an environmental scan, and then finally to understand leading practice in mitigating vicarious trauma risk. So just to give you a sense of how we went about addressing each of these objectives and also of our time here today, we'll talk a little bit about what we learned in our term of background desktop research at school prior to coming here to Melbourne. Then we'll talk about what we learned in our conversations with support staff individuals themselves. Over 2 months here, we talked to 18 different individuals ranging from 12 different agencies. Then we'll talk about what we learned from speaking to each of the 15 agency managers, each of the 15 of ESF's member agencies. We'll then talk about what we learned from various different people with specialist knowledge, including researchers, psychologists, EAP providers, ESF representatives, lawyers, and others. And then finally, we'll close out with our study conclusions, as well as some recommendations of leading practice.
So as Ella said in the agenda, we're going to start with what we learned during the preparatory term when we did background research and a literature review. So we learned that any traumatic event has a ripple effect. So as it's seen in the emergency sector, when something fatal happens to a member of the community, the front line is the first to feel the trauma of that individual, followed by the emergency support staff and even the families of these workers. And focusing on the emergency support staff themselves, it's important to recognize that even though they aren't at these events, they can still deeply feel the effects of it. So one objective of our preliminary research was to define what vicarious trauma was. So this is the definition that we came up with before speaking to anyone in the emergency sector. And we said that vicarious trauma is a trauma-based condition onset by cumulative secondary exposure to other people's traumatic experiences.
In addition to attempting to define vicarious trauma during our preliminary research period, we also came up with a short list of roles that we found in the emergency management sector that we believe conform to our definition of support roles, including dispatchers, human resources staff, counselors, recovery workers, communication staff, and interpreters. Additionally, from our preliminary research, we identified some of the factors that contribute to the risk of developing vicarious trauma. These factors are known as psychosocial hazards, of which there are 14 different types characteristic of any given workplace. These factors don't inherently cause vicarious trauma themselves, but their prevalence in the sector can greatly increase vicarious trauma's impacts. Now, we will be discussing our learnings from our support staff interviews throughout this environmental scan. As Fredy alluded to previously, these were the 6 roles we anticipated would be the most prevalent in our environmental scan. However, we were significantly wrong. After a total of 39 different interviews, this number increased from a small 6 to over 80 different support roles that were suggested to be support staff, including call takers, forensic individuals, chaplaincies, coroners, and etc., with all these listed on the screen. With a substantial number like this, we were now left to ponder about the impact of vicarious trauma in support staff. In discussing with support staff in varying degrees, every single individual spoke about how vicarious trauma impacted them. Every single individual. This confirmed the idea and purpose of our project that vicarious trauma among support staff is a topic needing more discussion. However, we found that in doing this, vicarious trauma impacts all individuals in different manners.
Vicarious trauma is a deeply personal and, as Gavin said, impacts each person differently, just as direct trauma would affect each frontline worker differently. And these impacts can largely fall under 2 large categories. So the first being personal. And the following quotes are quotes we gathered from speaking with these support staff individuals themselves on how it impacted them on a personal level. So one individual said, "Each day I had this video reel playing in my head." Another said she was starting to have flashbacks about jobs she's dispatched on, speaking about a fellow coworker. And someone else said, "I started having nightmares about the events that she learned about at work." And this is just a very small subset, obviously just 3 of the impacts that vicarious trauma can have on other ones. We also heard from individuals countless other ways that it impacted them, such as withdrawing from friends and family, hypervigilance, just general anxiety about work, not coming to work, and so much more. And then in addition to impacting the individual very deeply, we also found that vicarious trauma can also impact each agency on a more organizational level. So some quotes we gathered from managers regarding this are, "No one was looking after me, making sure my work was done." We see it being the impacts of vicarious trauma in the form of people just withdrawing. We see it in staff turnover. And so, of course, if the workers in your agencies are not feeling their best mentally and emotionally, they're not going to be able to complete their work to the best of their ability. And therefore, their teams and the community need that they're ultimately there to help may suffer as a result. And one of the reasons why the impacts of vicarious trauma may reach the point of these symptoms appearing for a person is due to this self-stigma that we discovered many support staff in the emergency sector believe to be true. This sentiment that we heard over and over again in many of our interviews was, quote, "There's always someone else who needs it more than me," referring to the fact that support staff do not think that their work quite measures up to the work of frontline workers because they're not out in the field fighting fires, etc. And that they do not feel like they have the right or they are deserving of seeking help. So this leads to a cycle of support staff feeling these heightened emotions and potentially the early signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma, not validating those feelings within themselves, and then not utilizing mental health support, therefore increasing their risk of worsening the symptoms that might already be presenting themselves.
So another conclusion we made by speaking with the support staff is that there's a wide range of how support staff feel supported by their agency regarding vicarious trauma. On one end, we talked to support staff who have no mental health initiatives in place and do not feel supported by their agency whatsoever. And they've said, we are not addressing mental health at all. Meanwhile, other agencies have a diverse amount of initiatives available for all their staffs and their needs. And they explain it's a constant support. It doesn't come and go. It's there all the time. And there are also support staff who see initiatives in place, but still wish there was additional support. And they said that we don't have enough on vicarious trauma. Focuses are on the physical impacts. We acknowledge that the fact that we couldn't have gotten every perspective in the sector, but from what we did see, there's a widespread range of support depending on which agency support staff belong to. Outside of the workplace, support staff are also using their own coping mechanisms to help them deal with the effects of vicarious trauma. We found the coping mechanisms they use depend on each individual and their values. Some individuals turn to religion and faith, while others use social connection. We found many people use physical activity like riding their bike to work or taking a walk around their neighborhood. A lot of support staff focus on their mindset as well. An example of this is one individual said to us that they come into work recognizing that not everyone can be saved and they will complete their job to the best of their ability. And this realization really helps them. Also, informally debriefing can be helpful. This includes talking to someone, usually a therapist or spouse, about their struggles at work. And all these strategies are categorized as using self-care to help support staff cope with work stressors.
This next section will focus on the information that we gathered from agency managers. Having spoken to each of the agency's well-being or general managers, we've been able to categorize each agency based on the way that they approach vicarious trauma through their initiatives. The first category encompasses agencies that acknowledge vicarious trauma as an issue, but haven't given it any specific consideration or have any proactive or reactive initiatives addressing it. The next category describes agencies that acknowledge vicarious trauma, but additionally have initiatives and support structures in place to help support staff recover from vicarious traumatization after the fact, only being reactive. The final and ideal category involves agencies that fit into both the red and yellow categories, but on top of having reactive measures, also have proactive measures and initiatives in place for helping to prevent the development of vicarious trauma in the first place. Once we're gathering all this information, we created this diagram quantifying how many agencies fit into each category based on the information that the agency managers provided to us. Though there's definitely a fair amount of agencies employing proactive measures to prevent vicarious trauma, there's still plenty of room for improvement.
As Fredy mentioned, and after looking at the results of our pinwheel, we understand there is room for improvement in the sector. However, on the other hand, there are a lot of good things happening to address vicarious trauma, and it is critical for all agencies to make this known so they can see what successful initiatives look like. Vicarious trauma as a whole in the sector and respective agencies needs to be talked about more. According to a psychologist we spoke to within the sector with this quote on the right, just having this conversation brings vicarious trauma to the forefront and brings awareness. The small things can make a difference, however, there needs to be a level up regarding awareness. And as I mentioned, some agencies have been increasing their awareness and it deserves to be recognized and applauded. One general manager explained to us that within their agency, they normalize the conversation of vicarious trauma and sincerely recommend and suggest that emotions are talked about in any moment. Also, another team leader of call takers referred to the agency that they possess as the only one where crying is normal, where emotions can be showed completely regarding vicarious trauma. From our research and seeing the lack of awareness, ignoring vicarious trauma is a detrimental mistake. These agencies promoting awareness and not sweeping it under the rug ought to be followed by the rest of the other agencies within this sector as a whole.
So the recruitment process can also deeply affect how much potential employees are aware of potential triggers in a job in the emergency sector can have. During our manager interviews, one individual mentioned that staff said, "I didn't know I was going to be exposed to this. I didn't know this was part of the job." Therefore, their employees were unprepared for the amount of traumatic material they were exposed to daily, which makes them reevaluate if this career is for them. On a positive note, there are ways to avoid this issue, and multiple agencies are showing how. As said in the quote, if you're prepared, that can reduce the shock. A very helpful preventive measure to help mitigate vicarious trauma we've seen is being very clear in the career description that you have a risk of being exposed to graphic material that could be traumatic. This way, every potential employee knows exactly what they're signing up for before they even interview with the agency.
Education is also a vital piece in understanding what vicarious trauma is and what impacts it can have on somebody. In this quote on the left, one agency manager we spoke to shared with us that people are not even being aware of the symptoms is a barrier. And when they are aware of the symptoms, not realizing you need help is also a barrier. When support staff do not fully know or understand what vicarious trauma is or how it might present itself, they're not able to fully recognize the signs of it early and seek out the help that they need. One psychologist we spoke to within the sector compared vicarious trauma to erosion, saying it's super predictable. You can see it coming, but it happens so slowly that it's hard to catch it until something is at its breaking point. It makes it really hard for people to reach out because they have to have the insights to the fact that it is happening. So without this insight, they won't be able to address it before it becomes a larger issue for themselves. And then still, as this quote alludes to, even if support staff are able to recognize it within themselves, the self-stigma that we spoke about before and other factors might still come into play, and they might not be able to realize that they actually need support and feel like they can handle it on their own. So this emphasizes the need for educational programs and materials to help support staff understand what vicarious trauma is, what resources are available, which several agencies we spoke to are currently doing and are planning to implement in the near future, which we'll speak a little bit more about later. But several also noted it as a point where they'd like to improve.
One point of agreement that we came upon from both support staff as well as from manager interviews is on the importance of proper managerial training regarding vicarious trauma. As the quote states, if you think about the problem at the core, managers understanding their people's exposure to vicarious trauma and the impact, and the managers actually changing the job design for these people is probably the best way to mitigate risk. The odds of early intervention on the agency's end is greatly increased if a manager of any given team is able to identify vicarious trauma in their support staff, as well as in themselves. In addition, a manager that understands vicarious trauma is more likely to be conscious of mental health overall, making them more approachable by the staff who work for them if they're having any issues. A large part of ensuring that people are coming forward regarding their issues is making sure that they feel valued and cared for by their superiors. Additionally, because managers have the capability to alter job design and tasks, from a logistical standpoint, they have a lot of power when it comes to preventing vicarious trauma exposure. Changes in shifts or switching an individual to a different task altogether are excellent ways to prevent vicarious trauma.
So by talking to the managers, these are the initiatives currently in place that they stated are the most helpful at mitigating risk to vicarious trauma. First is access to an employee assistance program, or EAP. These are programs specifically designed to help employees resolve personal issues that have the possibility of affecting their mental well-being and performance at work. The EAP service is confidential and accessed voluntarily. However, our research shows that views on EAP are variable. When workers use EAP, they're talking on the phone to faceless strangers who don't understand the challenges of working in the emergency sector. Another initiative in place is peer support. Peer support has proven to be successful to allow the support staff to open up to their colleagues. Compared to the EAP, these colleagues share similar experiences and are able to meet face-to-face, which makes a much more comfortable conversation. These peers are also trained to give proper support and recommend additional resources if necessary. A critical statement in the emergency sector is making it okay to be vulnerable and seek help. This can be done through workplace culture. When talking to the managers, they found it effective to put an extra effort to essentially set the tone of the workplace and have it be a supportive and welcoming environment that doesn't shame when an individual is suffering from consequences on the job. Another initiative is multiple managers found successful was the use of regular check-ins and debriefs. This allowed them to keep a watch for unusual changes in behavior, which is important because from our research, we found that the people who know you the best are more likely to see you struggle before you recognize it in yourself. Finally, mental health training has also been beneficial at helping employees better understand what vicarious trauma is and how it can affect them. By giving them education on work stressors that can affect their mood and behavior, they can better identify a struggle within themselves and use the other initiatives that are in place. Although these initiatives have been effective when used, there are barriers in place that make it difficult for support staff to get support related to vicarious trauma. When speaking to the managers, they brought up multiple logistical barriers. With a heavy workload, there might not be enough time in the day to access these initiatives. And also, budgets are a very important aspect since there needs to be funding for these initiatives to be put into place and remain successful. Next, a big struggle in the emergency sector is stigma. During our interviews, we found that a lot of support staff believe they don't deserve support compared to the front line. Also, there tends to be a macho culture in the emergency sector. This culture is a stereotypical toughness that is exaggerated to the point that mental health and vulnerability are frowned upon, which can make it difficult to use the initiatives. The third barrier we found by speaking to managers is a lack of awareness. This includes not knowing the signs to see in yourself or your coworkers and being aware of the initiatives in the first place.
So given these barriers and in speaking with the managers from each of the agencies, there was a widespread acknowledgement that more still does need to be done. In each interview, we asked the managers what is currently being planned in regard to addressing vicarious trauma specifically. And some managers articulated the sorts of things that they thought would be helpful and are in the works for their agency. So first, is the risk factor assessment that's been newly mandated by WorkSafe, and many managers spoke about their current and planned work in assessing each of their teams and the psychosocial and other hazards that they may be exposed to in order to figure out how to appropriately and adequately address any of those risks to hopefully prevent the risk of vicarious trauma. Second, we heard a lot about wanting extensions to peer support programs, either creating new peer support programs that if they don't already exist, or building one up that already exists. So as Hunter mentioned before, peer support programs through our interviews were noted as one of the most helpful mental health programs just because of the fact that they're more personal than EAP programs and kind of build that sense of community within agencies. So many agencies would like to create or enhance their peer support programs in the future. Third is just a general understanding that vicarious trauma simply just needs to be talked about more. Many managers mention that this may come in a variety of different forms, such as increased workshops or trainings, etc. And then on the subject of training, many managers also noted that vicarious trauma needs to be implemented into the agency's standard mental health trainings, as well as increased mental health and vicarious trauma specific trainings for managers and team leaders, so that they're better equipped to help both themselves and their teams. And then finally, throughout our interviews, we notice just a general acknowledgement by managers that sometimes support staff can be unnecessarily overexposed to traumatic material that's not absolutely vital to the work or task they're doing at any given time. So many of them hope to limit this, partly with the help of that risk assessment, and to make sure that exposure to potentially traumatic events and other risks are kept to a minimum as much as possible.
This next section goes a bit into what we learned from specialists in the field of our research. Our definition of vicarious trauma changed drastically from what we originally had it as from our preliminary research period. As a refresher, this is what it looked like originally. One of the biggest points of critique we received from both managers and subject matter experts was the use of the word condition, which you may have noticed has changed from our original definition. As vicarious trauma isn't technically a medical condition, it more so ties into the realm of psychological phenomena, so we wanted to avoid medicalizing it. Additionally, we had originally thought that vicarious trauma can only be brought on from cumulative exposure. However, another important piece of information we received is that in some cases, all it takes is one moment of exposure to vicariously traumatized individual, and it's entirely dependent on their personal life experiences.
In addition to our updated definition of vicarious trauma, the other big portion we learned from these individuals is that education on vicarious trauma is available for agencies to utilize. Some of this availability comes from Converge International, Phoenix, Australia, where our team actually enrolled in their 6-module vicarious trauma course covering topics of trauma and its impacts, signs of vicarious trauma, resilience, coping strategies, and self-care plans, with many other topics popping up here and there. Lastly, it's CPSU's specific training that comes from an ongoing research project. Overall, these are 3 different unique options. However, there has been a catch in the sector. In our research, we heard from one of these education providing organizations that the cost of training holds back agencies from utilizing these resources, which is a topic of discussion when allocating money within agencies to promote all levels of vicarious trauma education. To briefly conclude our research and results before moving into recommendations, it is critical to re-emphasize that the impact of vicarious trauma within the emergency sector is profound and deeply significant. This study we have conducted provided an environmental scan and lived experience that has never been done before. Also, there is a need to increase vicarious trauma awareness and education, and most importantly, normalize the conversation of vicarious trauma, specifically for those support staff who feel they haven't been impacted positively by the work done so far.
So after speaking with our many conversations with individuals in support roles, agency well-being, and general managers, and various people with specialist knowledge, we noticed some measures, initiatives, and just overall mindsets that were particularly helpful in mitigating vicarious trauma risk. And so from this, we developed a few different recommendations for agencies to think about when addressing vicarious trauma in their own workplace. Our first recommendation is to think about the need to provide honest and transparent recruitment that paints a true picture of the potential exposure to vicarious trauma. So as we mentioned previously, there are a few agencies that currently have a focus on this honest and transparent recruitment process, but many others that have noted it as a point where they would want to improve. So this honest recruitment process might entail making sure posted job descriptions are transparent regarding exposure to potentially traumatic material to ensure that candidates are mentally prepared and educated before starting work or even taking the job in the first place. And a common theme in our interviews with managers and sometimes support staff themselves is that they sometimes step into a role without a clue of the material they may be exposed to, compared to, for example, a frontline worker like a firefighter or a police officer, where it's a little more well known exactly what they might be getting themselves into. One agency also noted that they are implementing some type of psychological screening for candidates that are applying for a role that might be at higher risk for vicarious trauma, just to make sure they're fit for that high risk role. Our second recommendation is to think about raising awareness that support staff are as eligible for mental health support as frontline workers. So this recommendation specifically targets that self-stigma that many support staff might place on themselves. So what this will do is kind of create and emphasize that community and a shared understanding among workers, both frontline and support staff, that they're all part of a larger team working for a larger purpose that cannot be fulfilled without each of their input, and they all have to be feeling their best in order to achieve that goal. So this can look like specifically tailoring messages and some mental health resources to support staff, and then also just simply being cognizant of the self-stigma that exists among support staff, because each time that this stigma is specifically and explicitly addressed, it can begin to be chipped away at until eventually all support staff hopefully feel deserving of seeking support when they need it. And actually, as an extension of our study here, we're going to be filming and putting out a podcast episode with ESF and a few different individuals in support roles that we've spoken to throughout our research to give them the space to share their stories and to hopefully normalize the conversation around vicarious trauma in support staff.
So our third recommendation is to educate managers on vicarious trauma so they can understand how vicarious trauma affects them as well as their employees. So with this, managers can review their own agency training regarding mental health to ensure training on vicarious trauma is adequate and impactful. And then also consider the existing training available. Like Gavin talked about before, Converge, Phoenix, and CPSU are all examples of training that include education on vicarious trauma. So ensuring training is available and used can allow for a better understanding of the potential risk of vicarious trauma, as well as having the tools available to mitigate exposure.
Our next recommendation is with regards to sharing information between agencies within the sector. This could be through ESF's learning network, or it could be something as simple as a website or database. Agencies could provide information as to what their existing and developing vicarious trauma initiatives look like, made readily available to other agencies. Additionally, this platform could serve as a means for staff to provide input and feedback on these existing initiatives. If any agency finds something that works, they can simply share it with the other agencies. It doesn't really have to be anything convoluted. You may already be familiar with the concept of a mental health continuum, but just in case you aren't, it's a metric that workers can use to gauge their mental health status by citing examples of what symptoms they may be experiencing at each level. Mental health continuums are used across the sector, but they're usually broader as to be accessible by everyone, with the experiences and symptoms a person may be experiencing at each mental health level not being specific to any one role. Our recommendation regarding continuums is to create an additional modified one applicable for support staff specifically, with the criterion at each level more so resembling the impacts that they may be subject to in their roles in particular.
To round out our presentation here today, we want to send an enormous thank you to the Emergency Services Foundation, specifically Susan McKenzie, Naomi Watt, and Ainsley Patton, as well as to everyone on this call and all of our interviewees who made the study possible. Before opening it up to questions, I would like to once again reiterate that our podcast Monday will be available on ESF's website soon, as well as our written report that will also be available, as well as this recording of our webinar. So before opening up to questions, once again, thank you so much for your attention during our work, and we would love to answer any clarifying questions.
Thank you, team. Lorraine, I have to say, I think that's high distinction work. I think they've done an amazing job. And I think really this work shows the benefit of every single one of ESF's 15 member agencies participated in this program. And, you know, it really showed what a great result. And as Gavin said, you know, this has not been done before. And it's really achieved our aim to put vicarious trauma on the table and open up the conversation. And I think you've done some you've provided the sector with some really great recommendations that they can each go away and think about what they're doing. And that's a fantastic outcome from this work. Now, I can see people congratulating you on what you've done, but we haven't got any questions. At the risk of putting you on the spot, Tony Walker, I'm sure you would have a question. I might start. Tony, over to you.
No, Susan, I was going to say I had to walk away for about 10 minutes of that, so I'm just literally hit back on this.
Okay.
I'll let someone else ask.
I'm sorry. I'm going to ask a question to start with. ESF has recently done a study on compassion fatigue. Peter Romanis did a scholarship on compassion fatigue. What would you see as the difference between compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma? Because I know when you spoke to some of the managers, there was a little bit of, you know, there's all these new things coming at them. How would you respond to that?
I can answer this one. I think largely with adjacent terms like that, there's certain distinctions to be made with regards to how an individual is able to empathize with other individuals. And when it comes to vicarious trauma, largely the issue is over empathizing and over identification with another person's traumatic experience. Whereas with compassion fatigue, that prolonged exposure to hearing those stories provides difficulty to continue empathizing with those stories. It's the difference between the ability to empathize kind of diminishing over time due to that experience, and that versus that empathization increasing to a problematic extent due to that exposure. So that's probably the largest difference between the two conditions, although they are very closely linked together.
Okay, very good, Fredy. Thank you. There's a question here. Can you just reiterate, and I know you did this a little bit at the start, but just reiterate, what are some of the symptoms of vicarious trauma that people should look out for?
I think I can start on this very briefly before passing it to Ella, because I know she's done a lot of work on this. The biggest thing before even acknowledging the symptoms, obviously each individual is going to be very, very different. And that's when it comes down to the managerial staff and being able to use their own skills to identify it within their individuals. So it all starts with the managers. But to answer that question, a big one that we came apart or learned from all of our different examples was definitely the idea of individuals acting different, or whether that's obviously showing up to work late, kind of leaving work early, just not acting the same. And I know Ella has a few other good examples that will most definitely reiterate our points.
Yeah, so as Gavin mentioned, it can look different for anybody, but one that came up a lot was kind of those physiological symptoms, kind of feeling it within your body, those nightmares that we talked about before, kind of replaying in your head, just a general anxiety around going to work, hypervigilance kind of made potentially around the type of scenario that kind of caused the reaction in the first place, whatever the material you're looking at work kind of included. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be, we had countless, so those are just a few examples.
So the main thing is, and you touched on this, Gavin, it's change. It's about noticing change in people. And I think the point that you were really trying to make is that managers need to know their people to be able to recognise change. And it's the point that Shannon often makes in our mental health matters workshops is that somebody can go and see a psychologist, and that psychologist will see how they are today, but they don't know how they were last week or last month or last year. But the manager does, because working from home aside, they see people on a day-to-day basis and they can recognise the change in people, which is so important. Anne-Marie's asked a question here about, did our conversations include executive leaders in the agencies and how a top-down approach can improve outcomes? I can probably answer that for you, Anne-Marie. No, it didn't. They didn't speak to executive leaders, and it was just beyond the scope of this program and the timing. And, you know, they did an enormous number of interviews in the time that they were here, and they focused on the wellbeing managers and then getting that lived experience, which is so important and will come out more in their podcast. Sue Jamison has asked a question. I love the way that you've incorporated all the material from diverse content that came from the interviews and your desktop research. Apologies that she had to step away, and you may have covered it, but from all of this, do you still view vicarious trauma as a condition and a risk or an experience?
Definitely kind of as our change in definition kind of reflected. A feedback we got a lot is that no, it's not a condition. It's a very natural response to the type of material that these support staff might be exposed to in their work. And that kind of goes along with the idea of normalizing it, that like truly the only way to get rid of the risk is to not do the work, which obviously is not going to happen. So it's just a normal human response. And it's just a matter of kind of mitigating the risk as much as possible and then dealing with having support systems available when needed. So yes, I would say it's more of an experience rather than a condition.
And as Ella or Hunter, I've forgotten, talked about the new psychosocial risk assessments that are mandated are really going to be forcing organisations to take a close look at all the different roles and the risks associated with all those roles. And as the team said, when they first started out, I mean, I gave them my own experience as a communication manager and the vicarious trauma that I experienced in that role. And they came up with, you know, half a dozen roles that they thought were impacted. But then once they spoke with people, there was, how many was it, Gavin, you said that you came up with in the end?
39 different interviews, but some of them possess multiple people.
Yeah, but how many different roles
Oh, sorry.
yeah,
We had over 80.
Over 80 different roles in the sector that in this study identified the potential risk of vicarious trauma. Sorry, Sue. Yes, they did meet with you, and you are an executive in the sector. Yes, they did. You were one of the few, to be perfectly honest, that they did meet. So it wasn't a specific cohort group of executive leaders, though. Yeah, apologies for that, Sue. Terry has asked a question about, is this great work is there a plan to overlay this work with cultural work? And Terry, I guess that's up to the agencies, but certainly I think the message is loud and clear that the issue of vicarious trauma needs to be brought into all various training programs and so forth. And certainly with our Leading for Better Mental Health program, we're continuously improving that all the time, and that will be built into that as an example.
yeah, I guess my concern was that it happens at lower levels and is not something that's really has a reality to it at the higher levels.
And that's hopefully what we're doing with this study, and it will be sent as a matter of course to all of the heads of agency and so forth. And I know they really appreciate, this sort of work that's being done. Are there any other questions? I think really you've covered it, you've nailed it, and in terms of what you've presented. So I think people are speechless. But yeah, they've done very, very well. So I would just like to reiterate my thanks again. Lorraine, would you like to just say a few words about the benefit of this work for your students from Worcester Polytech?
Yes, the whole reason for this program and for this third year university project is to get these scientists and engineers out of the laboratories. They're very good at their technical work, but we really do want them to understand the relationship between some of the technical aspects, technical knowledge and social knowledge, and to understand human contexts and how solutions always need to be designed for specific communities and really understanding various cultures, et cetera. So this kind of project is really valuable. Many of our students come in not knowing what a nonprofit organization is. They're headed for industry. So this really exposes them, I think, to a lot of global challenges we have around the world. We have project centers all over the world, but this work with you, Susan, and the ESF, and in fact, other emergency agencies in Melbourne has been really useful. I guess I'd like to ask the students what you took away from this project and how you think it has benefited you.
Yeah, of course. So I can start with that. And first and foremost, for anyone on this call who doesn't know, Lorraine Higgins and Jonathan Chi are our advisors, and we'd like to also just give them a big thank you for all the work they've done for us. But the biggest thing I most definitely have taken away is obviously being on the other side of the world, dealing with a topic we had no familiarity with. It's definitely opened my horizon and allowed me to have a cultural shock in the best way possible, where now I feel totally comfortable and know that I can do something that at times I didn't think was going to be possible before. So I really do admire working in different groups now and kind of just putting myself out there and not shying away from anything. And I think that's probably been the biggest thing for me so far, just learning this new experience.
Well, what about you, Hunter?
Yeah, just to add on to that, for me, I think it's really interesting to learn about just how like the workplace and organizations and even how they work in general, just going from like a very mathematic based school, all our problems are either right or wrong. It's very straightforward, it's very clear, but there's so many different approaches, there's so many different options and solutions to be done. It's really nice.
Ella?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that definitely had a big impact on me from quite literally the very beginning of our preparatory term was that idea of the ripple effect. Kind of like everything in this world affects everything, which kind of is somewhat obvious, but to kind of connect that back to my own work, as I'm studying civil engineering, so kind of it affects the public a lot. And so kind of thinking about that human aspect of it, and in any other engineering field, like what you're actually creating or building is going to actually affect other people and other people out farther than that. So that resonated with me a lot in this work.
And Fredy?
I think that I can speak for most of my group. Yes, we're very technically oriented and we think about things from a technical standpoint. I've conducted scientific research, but never something grounded like this. And I think oftentimes I would get caught up in, and most of our professions are going to be revolved around advancements made with regards to technological capabilities. But the fact is that there's so many vast issues facing so many different industries around the world. And I mean, the world is just more than technology and what can be done about that. And I think getting the opportunity to do a project that's a bit more human and where we're talking and hearing individual stories has been really impactful. And furthermore, I think specific skills that have definitely improved is knowing what questions to ask, knowing how to get information from stories and kind of how to understand where people are at with their experiences. So definitely something that I think has been a really important part of our curriculum.
I think another thing to just mention very, very briefly is that idea of relationships, where every single person we talked to, the first thing we did was build a relationship with them. And obviously the four of us dealing with vicarious trauma, you can imagine the work kind of took a toll on us at times. So halfway, or not halfway, fully across the world, away from my family, who's like my biggest support, I relied on these three individuals around me for support. And it also taught us the importance of being there for one another. So I think that and the relationships aspect was something that's just priceless and irreplaceable that this experience had given us.
Thank you. Yes, look, I can't say thank you enough for this fantastic piece of work. When I met you in Worcester a few months ago, I came away feeling very confident that we were going to have a great outcome, and we certainly have. And I look forward to doing the podcast with you on Monday and bringing the lived experience to this presentation. So this will all be made available on ESF's website over the coming weeks. And we thank you very much for joining us today, and thank the students very much for their fantastic work. You've really contributed to and filled a gap in learning that we very much needed. So thank you all very, very much.